Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to this group for the Enrichment series. For those of you who don't know me, I'll give you a little bit about my background. So as you can see, I'm a pharmacist by training. I was an investigational pharmacist for a number of years at Froedtert Hospital. And then during that time, in 2009, I joined the IRB and really learned that I loved that aspect of research specifically. And so that's where I really started to look more into the regulations and learn how they apply to the research that we were reviewing. And then I was able to move into a new position at MCW when they were looking to help build out the support resources for investigator-initiated studies. So I do run a program in the Office of Research that is intended to help provide some assistance with FDA-regulated research in a variety of fashions. And then last year, I was able to get the regulatory affairs certification. That's the RAC drugs certification that is available through RAPS. So to kick things off today, I wanted to just go over a few objectives, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to identify when an IND is needed for an investigator-initiated clinical trial specifically, describe the key components of a successful IND application, and then be able to articulate some of the common challenges when interacting with the FDA. And feel free if you want to put questions in the chat as you think of them. Sarah, feel free to interrupt me. If anybody just wants to come off mute and ask a question, that's fine too.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I was going to just say one more thing. About midway through, we're going to do some poll questions. So it's just a short link that will have you can sign into any device, your cell phone, just to answer about 5 poll questions midway through.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll be using Poll Everywhere if you're familiar with that software. All right, so diving into some background information. I always like to go through history of the regulations too. I don't know why. But so we really saw the development of the IND regulations as it relates to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which we know is under the DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, whose primary mission is to protect public health above everything else for the American society. So IND regulations weren't always in place when that regulatory body was established. So its scope has changed considerably since its inception. And it's generally in response to some sort of large public health disaster. So I'm sure many of you know the thalidomide story, and it's the IND process that actually was the one of the results when thalidomide, just to review it briefly, for those of you who maybe don't know the details. So thalidomide was first developed in Europe and widely prescribed specifically in Germany in the early 1950s. And it was indicated for anxiety, insomnia, and morning sickness. It had never been tested on pregnant women, and it was widely used in the 50s and 60s, being prescribed in several countries, over 46 countries. So through that exposure, we had 10,000 children who were born with severe deformities. And the most visible being the limb malformations that you might remember. And so several of these infants died after birth, but thankfully, the FDA did not recommend approving thalidomide when it was being widely used in Europe because of its lack of data in pregnant women. And so they were requesting clinical trials in order to prove its safety and effectiveness, initially. And it was through that exposure, so we had women who were exposed to thalidomide through clinical trials who then had these birth defects. And so, obviously it was quickly taken out of clinical trials. And then we had the Kefauver Harris amendments of 1962. And so those amendments were passed that actually required the demonstration of efficacy in addition to safety. And so that's where the clinical trial concept comes from, actually. So it was a little unique that thalidomide actually was in clinical trials. So anyway, those regulations, the amendment that was passed there established the phases of the clinical trials, 1 through 4, that everybody is familiar with. And that is when the IND request also came into play here. And so in order to proceed into those clinical trials, drug companies needed to submit their request to the FDA to be able to show that they believe it's safe enough to give to humans, and they can demonstrate the manufacturing process is safe. And they wanted to be able to have that input early on, they being the FDA, wanted to have that input early on in the clinical trial development. And so that drastically changed the pharmaceutical industry at the time. So these amendments were quite controversial at the time, but due to them, this is where we are today. So we also have just a brief overview here of that clinical development process. And I'm sure everybody has seen some version of this. And you can see that initial IND application is really at the point before the phase 1 clinical trials. And it's through that preclinical drug development where you're demonstrating the safety in animal models, although the FDA is trying to get away from animal models, and that's a whole other discussion. But then also be able to see the toxicology studies in addition to that, along with the pharmacology and the ability to demonstrate that there's a thought behind how that specific drug will work in a certain disease. And so, obviously today, as far as this presentation goes, we'll be focusing on the IND application portion. So let's start out with the definition of an IND. The IND submission, like I previously already kind of mentioned, it's a request to the FDA. And it's a request to authorize that shipment of unapproved drugs across state lines in order to be able to use it in human clinical trials. And so this is the legal basis for allowing clinical testing. But we know that not all clinical trials require investigational or using investigational drugs require an IND. And we'll get into those details in a little bit. So as far as finishing out that regulatory authority piece here, I mentioned the history already of the FDA. And so if we go back to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that was actually put into place in 1938. And it's the regulations under 21 CFR 312 that are specific to investigational new drug applications. There are certainly several other regulations that govern other aspects of research and new drug development. Primarily, the ones you're familiar with are the 21 CFR 56 for IRBs and 21 CFR 50, which also includes protection of human subjects or informed consent. I'm sure you're also very aware that the FDA has several centers. The 3 that I have listed here are those that I interact with most frequently. So first we have CEDAR, which is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. They primarily regulate the small molecules, other, drugs. But they also do regulate monoclonal antibodies as well, rather than CBER. CBER is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. So rather than drugs, they regulate biologics. And what we think of as biologics is things like blood, vaccines, tissues, cell therapy, gene therapy. These products are all derived from living sources. And so that's what makes them obviously so much more complex than those small molecules that the drugs are derived from. And then finally, there's CDRH. We won't be focusing on devices at all, but they are the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, where you go when you need an IDE for a device. So I wanted to throw in a few stats here, just to give you a little perspective, as far as the scope of the FDA's review. So roughly 2,000 INDs are submitted to the FDA on an annual basis, of which are type of academic submissions, otherwise known as investigator-initiated INDs or sponsor investigator INDs or research INDs. That's about a quarter-ish of the annual submission. We know the timeline for review is 30 days, assuming that you don't have a clinical hold at the end of that, and hopefully that doesn't happen. But you can see also with that next data point that the clinical hold rate for a first-time academic submission is a little bit higher. 30 to 40% of those first-time submissions might be placed on a partial hold or a full hold, compared to 20% for industry, which really isn't all that surprising since, we have our industry partners who have regular communication, and, we might have institutions that don't have that regular communication with the FDA because it might be a little bit less rare to, or a little bit more rare to submit an IND. So the most common therapeutic areas for academia, when you're talking about INDs, they see infectious diseases, neurology, and oncology the most frequently. So yeah, I just want to give a little bit of that context before going right into when an IND is needed. So if we first start with the regulatory criteria, again, with what is currently written in 21 CFR 312, they state that an IND is required for any clinical investigation of a drug or biologic that's not approved for marketing in the US, obviously. Or it's a clinical investigation that involves a new indication, a new dosage form, a new dosing regimen, or a new patient population. And that significantly, that piece significantly increases the risk of the use of the drug. So the FDA wants to be aware of those situations when an already approved drug is potentially going to be used in a different manner than it originally approved it for, and it significantly increases the risk. It's all about safety when we're talking INDs. So then if we take a look at the next definition to consider is what's a drug? Obviously, if you have somebody coming to you asking whether an IND is needed, or somebody has told you that you need an IND and you want to know why, this is always the first question, I ask, like, what are you doing with the drug? Because according to our regulations, our laws, a drug is considered an article or articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or they're articles intended to affect the structure or function of the body. And so obviously that second bullet point there means that it's not only those therapeutic purposes. So if you have a drug that you want to use for a physiological study like we've seen here. I've done several submissions for studies like that. It might be a drug that is not FDA approved and they need an IND because they're planning on using it in a physiologic challenge study or something like that. So then finally, as far as definitions go here, what's an investigational drug? So it's that same article, that language, they don't want to put too fine of a definition on it. Obviously, an article is not approved for marketing in the US as a drug, or it's an approved drug that is not used according to its approved label. Or it's used in combination with another approved drug that hasn't been tested before. And something that we always have to consider is the practice of medicine. The FDA will be the first ones to tell you that they don't regulate the practice of medicine. So that, as we keep it in mind, you know, you have to consider whether it is an investigational drug or an approved drug in this situation that is being used in a clinical investigation, not being used for their clinical care. And so that's where the practice of medicine no longer applies when you are using that approved drug in a clinical investigation. So that's an important point to keep in mind. So when we're talking about a clinical investigation, so it's an intervention, it's an experiment where you administer a drug to one or more subjects, more human subjects. And for the purposes of the IND regulations, it's again an experiment that uses any drug, whether it's approved or unapproved, except when it's being used for its marketed purpose in the course of regular practice. So that clinical investigation, that first sentence there, I think is probably the one that is the most pertinent to when you consider what is a clinical investigation. All right, so finally, we have what are lawfully marketed drugs then? So if you're talking about, you know, an IND for a drug that is not lawfully marketed in the US, we need to understand fully what that means. So that means that drugs are commercially available and legally marketed in the US as drugs. So you can use, again, interchangeably FDA approved drugs, FDA approved products, you know, using drugs according to their marketed purpose, anything like that. So what is, again, important to note here is that it's FDA approved for a specific indication. And that's what you need to consider also when you're taking a look at whether your marketed drug is going to be used in a clinical investigation and it is not following its FDA marketed approval through its drug labeling. All right, so next we're going to go through a few scenarios here for when do you need an IND. I think you probably know the easiest one. So if you have an investigational product, a drug article, whatever you want to call it, and it is not legally marketed in the US, so it's an investigational drug. So we know, bam, requires an IND. So those clinical investigations using products that are not lawfully marketed in the US as a drug requires an IND. So if it's marketed somewhere in Europe and you're able to import it here, you can't do that until you have that IND in place. So we know you need an IND here. What about the use of lawfully marketed drugs, like we were just talking about? Do you need an IND in that situation? Well, of course, this is the phrase that everybody in research loves to hear. It depends. So it depends on the situation that you are using it in. What are the details of the clinical investigation? And those details are really important to take a close look at when you're talking about the drug labeling. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of what's on label versus off label. So for lawfully marketed drugs involving your metformin, your common blood pressure meds, whatever they might be, they've been around forever. First, you need to take a look at that FDA label to determine whether an IND is needed. So the drug labeling is all of the printed material that goes along with the FDA approval, including the wrapping, the package insert, the container that it's packaged in, and all of that information that is included in that package insert or the label. Those terms are synonymous. Um, all of that information is what's considered on label. And anything that is not in that would be considered off label. And so one key point, I see this all the time with IRB applications. When the team wants to put in an application, they say, we don't need an IND because this drug, metformin, has been around forever. And we're just using it according to the standard of care. But when you take a close look, that standard of care might not be the same indication in the actual FDA approved label. And so that's something that I usually have to highlight for coordinators or principal investigators, whoever it might be. And so finally, I have a couple of links here that you should be able to use once you receive the slide deck. These are the databases that I go to in order to see the FDA approved label. The first one is from the FDA, their approved drugs, and then the second one is from the National Library of Medicine, or NIH. And so either one of these are great resources. Sometimes FDA database doesn't have a copy of the label in there for some reason. I haven't figured out why. But that's when I'll usually then switch over to the NIH database and take a look in Daily Med. So I want to walk through a few screenshots of that FDA database. And so this is the go-to place for what you would consider on label versus off label. So the list on the left-hand side of the screen there is what's found in the label. It's what's on label, the indication, dosage, administration. You can see all of that information is readily available there. And so usually it's those top 3 bullet points that we're taking a look at. Is the indication being changed? Is the dose being changed, or the dosing route with the administration, or the form and strength? So there's a little bit of nuance there. But you can also see that we're going to use an example here with that database on the right-hand side here. So when you put something like aducanumab, that's the example I'm using here. Hopefully you can see it. If not, zoom in. We then will get this screen that provides you, a couple of different options here. You can select the drug in the database through those different options that you have there. They have 2. I can't remember what the difference is. It's probably well, I'm not entirely sure now. I'd have to go back and look. Anyway, you can see at the bottom of the screen here, there's a couple of tabs that can then expand. And that includes the approval date, the letters, the labels, lots of information. So when you expand that, then you can see all of the different supplements after approval that have been submitted, and then the original approval as well. So some of those supplements might go ahead and change the label. So that's why we have these different options. You can see the description in there that they've changed the medication guide, the package insert. So if it's been updated, obviously you want to pick the most recent one. And so once you click on that hyperlink for the label PDF, then you'll get the package insert. And this is where, all of that information that you're looking for in order to make your decision can be used from this information here. So again, when we're talking on label, you're talking same indication, so same patient population, same dose, same route of administration, same drug formulation. So studies that involve the use of a marketed drug that is on label does not require an IND. You're using it according to the way the FDA wanted people to use it. And so as long as that data isn't going to be used by the sponsor of that drug, anyway, updating the label or changing the advertising or anything like that, you don't need an IND. And usually in academia, that's not the case. As far as off-label use, so it's anything that differs from anything in the label, including the drug combination, because the FDA will highlight when drug combinations can be used together in their labels. And again, we've talked about how off-label use is quite common in the practice of medicine, but once you step into that clinical trial field, then you really get into the details. And so if you have a study that is using a drug that is off-label, then you might need an IND. And so we're going to go back to that graphic again, and we already covered these. We're getting to that point of when do you need an IND for a lawfully marketed drug? And so we know it is not needed when the drug is being used on label, assuming that assuming there's no marketing or change in advertising. So investigators who don't have access to the license of that drug or have no part in actually running the pharmaceutical company that is marketing that drug, they have no rights to make any changes. So that's why this is kind of an afterthought when you're talking about marketing and advertising in the academic setting, at least. And so we know that that's not usually the case for research, right? You don't typically see drugs being used on label in an investigation, in a clinical trial. And so it's really that off-label use. Again, it depends on what you're doing in that clinical trial and what the risks are associated with it. So that's when we need to talk about IND exemptions. These exceptions do apply to only lawfully marketed drugs in the US, right? That's the starting point. That's why when I went through those definitions at the beginning, I started with what's a drug and what's a legally marketed drug, because that has to be in place in order for the IND exemptions to apply. And in order for drugs to be exempt from IND regulations in clinical trials, you have to satisfy all 5 of these criteria. And so we already established it's only for lawfully marketed drugs, and it is not intended to be reported to the FDA as a well-controlled study for a new indication or any other significant change in the label. If the drug is undergoing, if it's a marketed drug, the investigation is not intended to change the advertising. So we got the label in the first bullet point and the advertising in the second bullet point, like we said before. It's number 3 that we really start to question whether an IND is needed. So does it involve a route of administration or dosage level or patient population or anything else? Just to cover their bases, anything else that might significantly increase the risks or otherwise decrease the acceptability of the risks that's associated with the drug. And so it's usually that point where you really have to drill down with the investigator on what data do you have to support this change? Has it ever been done before? Do you have any case studies? Do you have any lab bench studies that support using it in this different patient population or at this higher dose. So those are the conversations that I have quite regularly with investigators. And then the last point, you have to make sure that you're going to follow the other FDA regulations that are necessary to run a compliant clinical trial. So, oh, and finally, the promotion of drugs. I always kind of forget about this one too, again, because in the academic setting, this is a non-issue. It just says it has to be run in compliance with requirements of 312.7, which is involved in the promotion of investigational drugs, which again is usually that's going to be coming from pharmaceutical industry, not on the academic side. All right, so that's the exemption criteria. I just want to highlight a couple of things that we have here at MCW. So our HRPP has kindly posted these exemption forms. And the top one on this list is the IND exemptions for marketed products. And so a lot of people are under the impression that you need to go to the FDA for an IND exemption, just like you would to get an IND. And that's not the case. You are able to have your PI basically think through that risk according to those deviations from the approved label. And they're able to, make that justification. And so at our institution, we have those checklists where they're able to attest that, yes, it meets all of these criteria to be IND exempt. And if it's questionable, and here is question 4, if it's questionable about whether the increased risk is related to a different patient population or dosage level or administration, that's where you need to add some justification. You can see that box there is intended to do that. Sometimes you're going to need to, attach a little bit more information, but this is what then is uploaded in our eBridge system in order to have the IRB review and agree with your determination too, in order to move forward. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second too. I wanted to highlight a couple of FDA guidances that are available as resources. And again, these are hyperlinks that, assuming they're not broken, will take you to these documents available on the FDA website. And so the first one is specifically for cancer treatment. They have a little bit more specific guidance for that group of patients and investigators. And then basically it's everybody else on the general guidance for IND exemptions. And the FDA really highlights, that physicians make these decisions every day about the risk of therapeutics that they're prescribing for their patients on a regular basis in the practice of medicine. So they trust that those individual investigators should be able to determine whether that exemption applies or not. And so it's that justification that needs to go to the IRB. The IRB then needs to evaluate, and that's why you have different expertise on the IRB. If they agree and they say, yep, this sounds good, then that's all that needs to be in place. Then it's considered that IND exempt study. But if the IRB disagrees, then you can go to the FDA and either submit a full IND and get that in place, or request the FDA to specify whether they think that the drug in that context, used in that context, would require an IND. So one other point I wanted to highlight is that we've had this question come up as well, because what's the difference? So if you're IND exempt, then you're not FDA regulated, right? That's not the case. If your drug, just like we went over in that exemption criteria, if your drug's exempt in that clinical investigation, it's still considered an FDA regulated clinical trial because you have to go follow the regulations in Part 56 and Part 50. And again, that's part of the exemption criteria that probably aren't highlighted as much when investigators are going through that checklist. All right, so I've spoken a lot there, and I wanted to now go through some test questions to test your knowledge. So Sarah's going to help me out here.
Yeah, so you can join on the computer you're at, or if you want to join on your cell phone, just go to polev.com/CTSI Academy. It has several prompts. You can just ignore those or X out of them. I'll give everybody just a moment to join, and I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, let's have you stop sharing. So I have the first
All right.
question activated.
Okay, so you can see the question here. These are just a couple of different case scenarios. So Dr. Garcia is a neurologist at your medical center. He wants to conduct a study evaluating cerebrolex. I don't know how we want to say that. But this drug is approved in Germany, not in the US, for treatment of a rare neurologic disorders. They want to enroll 30 patients, follow them for 6 months to evaluate safety and efficacy. All right, so yes, we've got 100% saying the drug is not lawfully marketed in the US, so yes, it does need an IND. Wonderful.
I think I can keep this active and just go to the next one.
Okay.
Yes, looking good.
Perfect. All right, so this one, Dr. Williams wants to conduct a study using cardiostat, which is an FDA-approved antihypertensive medicine. And he wants to use a standard FDA-approved dose throughout administration and wants to evaluate blood pressure. Do you need an IND? Again, wonderful. 100% saying no because the drug is being used according to its FDA-approved labeling. So no IND needed for this study. All right, halfway through here, Dr. Lee wants to investigate whether Dermacure, which is FDA approved for eczema, whether it could be effective for treating severe psoriasis. And he wants to use the standard FDA approved dose. So we've got 100% saying yes, because the investigation involves a new indication, not in the approved labeling. And generally, for the purposes of this poll, I'd say I would agree with you 100%. If it was if it was an investigator asking me, I'd want a little bit more detail to make sure that it wouldn't be considered exempt for some reason. All right, and then for this one, which of the following statements is true regarding IND requirements for this study? Dr. Thompson is planning a study to evaluate neurobalance, which is FDA approved for anxiety. He wants to study twice the approved dose to treat treatment-resistant depression. And we've got a little bit of debate going on here, looks like.
And it's fair, you can change your answer.
Yeah.
It is allowed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Software allows it.
Uh-huh. All right, so for this one, I would say an IND is required because it's twice the approved dose. You know, again, you'd have to know additional details on whether that's been studied before, whether there's any additional support to actually determine whether it could be IND exempt. All right, good.
Yeah, one more here.
One more. All right, which of the following statements is correct regarding IND exemptions for this study? So Dr. Roberts wants to conduct a study in kidney transplant patients with an FDA-approved immunosuppressant. And guess what? His study fulfills all 5 of these criteria, which hopefully sound very familiar. All right, so it looks like everybody identified that these were the IND exemption criteria. Yes, very good. Thank you. I'm glad everybody was on the same page with these questions. All right,
We are back.
there we go. Okay, so got a few more slides here to go through. And like I said, if there's any questions that come up, feel free to interrupt me. So this next section, we're going to talk about the IND components or the contents of the application. So this is the list here. It's not 100% exclusive. So I just highlighted really, these are the main components. There's a couple other that usually don't pertain to studies that are just not applicable for academic studies. So you can see here, these come straight from the regulations. It's really nice to have templates for these IND submissions and checklists too, in order to make sure that you're being comprehensive with your application. So starting with the 1571, this is what serves as the official IND application cover sheet from the FDA's perspective. It's required to be completed anytime you're submitting information to the FDA for the IND. So it's the initial submission, and then each time you are submitting an amendment, annual report, whatever it might be, this form is also submitted. Just of note, the upper right-hand corner has an expiration date on this form. And so you always want to be going to the FDA's website in order to pull the most recent form that's available. So that you're not using an expired version. You know, there might be changes that help you out here. So when investigators open their own IND, they're considered the sponsor investigator. FDA has the same requirements for pharmaceutical companies as sponsor investigators. So that PI needs to fulfill both the sponsor and the investigator requirements as it relates to clinical trials. Most INDs that I have submitted and it's usually a research IND. So one of the questions here is whether it's a commercial versus a research IND. Commercial means, you know, is that a going to be marketed eventually in the future for a therapeutic reason. And then one of the questions on here also is list all of the other INDs or data master files that are referenced in your application. So if you're going to cross-reference anything in the application because you're working with a drug company with a marketed product and they have an IND, you're going to list it here. And so that is helpful for the FDA to see upfront. And it's that letter of authorization that'll be required in order to have the FDA be able to reference that IND that they already have on file. So that's something that you request from the pharmaceutical company. Then finally, there's a box here for a serial number. So the numbering starts at 0000. And for the initial application, unless you, or it starts at 0000, and then it just goes up sequentially after that. All right, moving on to the investigator's brochure. If you're not familiar with this type of research, The investigator's brochure, it contains all of the information that the drug company knows about the drug. Basically, it's a living document as preclinical and clinical studies proceed. You'll see it updated. Anybody who sits on an IRB sees these updates come through quite frequently. So the drug information is like the pharmaceutical properties, formulation, storage, and handling. And then it just continues to grow. And this is where the investigators are supposed to be familiar with the investigator's brochure because it can provide them guidance on the toxicities to expect and how to manage them also. But as a caveat, research INDs aren't required to provide an ID if it's a single site. So if it is an investigational drug that is currently available on the market, you can cite the cross-reference that IND that is held by the pharmaceutical sponsor with that letter of authorization. If you're not partnering with a drug company because it's gone generic, all you have to do is find that package insert or the approved drug label, and you can reference that. You can put that hyperlink of one of those two databases that I showed you before. You can put that in right in your application and say, we're using this drug that is already commercially available, and we're using the commercial formulation. And then finally, I just wanted to make people aware. I'm not sure if people are aware of this or not, but all of that information from the investigator's brochure is what is distilled down to the approved package label. And the sponsors or the pharmaceutical companies have to annotate their drug label when they're submitting it after their marketing application to pull that information directly from the IB. Okay, moving on to protocol development. A well-written protocol will go hand in hand with a smooth IND review. So I just highlighted some of the basic information here that the FDA reviewers, the clinical reviewers, are going to want to see. So your primary, secondary, exploratory endpoints, these need to be very clearly defined and measurable. And as far as the study population goes, similarly, the eligibility criteria needs to be very clear. You want to, balance that ability to conduct the study with your patient population, with the objective of your clinical trial. And certainly you have to think of the special populations and additional precautions that might need to be in place if you're talking, pregnant women or pediatrics, whatever it might be. With your study design, certainly you're going to be thinking about those resource limitations and investigator-initiated studies. Want to limit the complexity in the study design. Thinking about whether this is going to be a single arm versus randomized. Are you going to use a placebo control as one of those arms? Statistical considerations. This is, again, is an important piece of the protocol because there will be statistician reviewers of the application when it goes in. And so they want to see this justification statistically of why you have decided to enroll that number of patients. Of course, you want to account for attrition rates. You want to be very clear in the stopping rules as well. Have, scientific justification and be able to account for both the individual stopping rules as well as the whole study stopping rules. Then finally, safety monitoring. If you have a DSMC, if you've already thought through this, contacted people, it might be required for your study, it might not, but you definitely want to make sure that you're very clear in your safety monitoring, because this is one of the points that can lead to a clinical hold. Just a couple other IND related things that I wanted to bring up in the protocol context. You can submit more than one protocol to the same IND, using the same drug. It has to be very similar indications. So that is something to consider. And then they're also going to want to have more information about the informed consent form. Usually I submit a draft ICF for review. And then the CV is going to be needed for your PI that goes along with the 1572. We'll talk about that in just a second. As far as protocol development tips, you know, I mentioned before having a template for the IND, using a template for the protocol is important so that you can look at those documents between the two and make sure that it's consistent. Engaging a biostatistician early to help plan that study design obviously is very important as well in order to satisfy the needs of the FDA reviewers. Including information about data management and quality control processes as far as data collection goes is very key as well. And we've already talked about the safety parameters. I just want to touch very briefly about CMC requirements. This is section 7 of the IND packet. And so this is also considered manufacturing. It's the chemistry, manufacturing, and control section. So can just be considered quality as well. So it's the quality of the product. So it gets into very specific details about the drug substance. That is the active pharmaceutical ingredient. So it's the raw materials that are used for manufacturing versus the drug product. And the drug product is what is the final drug formulation that will be used for distribution. And the FDA expects that these new unapproved drugs on the left-hand side here are following current good manufacturing practices as well. So then on the right, I have the alternative, and if you're studying a drug that is currently on the market, that's where you're either going to request the letter of authorization to cross-reference an IND from the pharmaceutical partner that you have, or you're going to reference that approved drug label. As far as documentation requirements and strategies, so as far as the electronic submission goes, investigator-initiated INDs can be submitted electronically. We do not have to follow the ECTD format, which is the electronic common technical definition. It can be put right into one big PDF and submitted for academic researchers. So that is something to keep in mind. Whether your institution is going to follow that ECTD format versus not. We already talked about templates and how important that is. And then certainly communication and what you're going to preface the submission with is important as well, which you can do with the cover letter. I have some pitfalls to avoid here in the interest of time. I'm not going to go through those, but I think they're pretty common sense to most people. All right, then some other requirements to keep in mind when you're submitting an IND and starting a new investigator-initiated clinical trial. So the 1572 is required from the sponsor to collect from the investigator. So being the investigator sponsor or sponsor investigator for an IIT study, obviously that investigator is going to be signing this 1572. It can then be sent into the FDA in order to provide some of the information that's required in the IND packet. So the form FDA 3674 relates to clinicaltrials.gov, and there's guidance out there as well about whether you need to post the study on ct.gov in order to comply with that. And then financial disclosures, even if you are not going to be submitting data to the FDA for a marketing indication, these conflicts of interest need to be collected before the investigation starts because it will be one of the places that you could get dinged for in an audit from the FDA. Not going to say too much about Part 11 compliance considerations, but similarly to the FDF disclosures, Part 11 should be something that you're thinking about as it relates to electronic signatures that are compliant, storage databases that are compliant. Those two things are covered by our Florence Advera eReg product that we use here. But then also consider the electronic data capture, the EDC, and whether that is going to be compliant and the importance of that again in an FDA audit. All right, just briefly, I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I already talked about the 30-day review period. Start to finish, that is the timeline that they have in order to review your FDA or your IND submitted to the FDA. So after that, that submission goes in, you'll get an acknowledgement letter that is sent to the investigator that documents the date that FDA received and processed the IND, and that's the start date. So it's after that that you will then expect an answer. So it is important to pay attention to your email after a couple of weeks, or have your investigator pay attention to their email, because often by about week 3, you're going to get an email from the RPM, the regulatory program manager, with questions from the reviewers, and you need to be able to respond to those in a timely fashion. And then at the outcome to expect at the end of that review period, it could either be clinical hold, safe to proceed, or no response. And if it is no response and the 30 days have passed, then you can go ahead and begin your clinical investigation. So just remember, it doesn't stop at that initial review. The IND management is a whole life cycle. So anytime there's big protocol amendments that change things, or like new preclinical information comes out, new formulations come out, those are protocol amendments and information amendments that need to be submitted for FDA. IND safety reporting, annual reports are another key submissions that need to be accounted for. And finally, once the investigation is wrapped up, you need to request to withdraw that IND as well. And so I think this is my last slide. I just really wanted to highlight the pre-IND consultation. I try to request that all of the investigators I work with do this initial consult, because it gives the FDA a heads up that there's an IND coming, and they will begin to shape their ideas around that initial contact with you, and you can get that early feedback in order to be able to meet the needs and avoid a clinical hold, especially if it is a complicated protocol or new cell therapy or something like that. So I think I'll stop there since we're out of time here. And certainly if anybody needs to, I don't know why there's, oops. Feel free to email me with any questions. I'm happy to take any questions from anybody who wants to hang on the line a little bit longer. Thank you, Caitlin. Any questions from anybody on the line? Drop the box link one more time for anybody who's on. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Excellent. Have a good day. Have a great day. Thank you.